Good afternoon, and welcome to a special week of reflecting on 1 year into the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on us as individuals, as members of the Jewish community, and on the wider world. I'm Andrew Seiler Carroll. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Week, the New York Jewish Week, which is now part of 70 Faces Media. And 70 Faces is the parent company of JTA, My Jewish Learning, Feller, Alma, and the Nasher. There have been so many ethical issues raised by the COVID pandemic, and we could start way back at the beginning a year ago. But I think we're going to focus on some of the more practical ones that are happening right now. And we've assembled a stellar panel of experts to discuss many of them. So let me quickly introduce them so we can dive right into our discussion. So joining us from the Bronx, Riverdale, is Dr. Yardena Osband. She's an assistant clinical professor of pediatrics at New York Medical College, and she's also the co-host of the daily Daf Yomi podcast, Talking Talmud. From Philadelphia, we have Dr. Rabbi Micah Peltz. He's an assistant clinical professor. Oh, no, he isn't. He's the senior rabbi at Temple Beth Shalom in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. He's a member of the Conservative Movement's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, and he's also the author of a Rabbinical Assembly Guidance. I'm not sure if it was a tshuva, a guidance on vaccination and ethical questions posed by COVID-19, the vaccine specifically. And last but not least is Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who is the rector and Saul and Ann Dorff Distinguished Professor in Philosophy at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. He's also visiting professor of law at UCLA School of Law. He is the chairman of the Rabbinical Assembly's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, and just last night, I believe, he was honored at the Rabbinical Assembly for his many years as chair, along with his co-chair, Rabbi Pamela Barmash. So Mazel Tov, Rabbi Dorff.
Thank you.
We're glad to have you. I want to start with vaccines because I think that is so of the moment. I'm one of those people who is frantically refreshing his browser trying to find someone who actually has a dose. So many of the questions surrounding vaccines have to do with both scarcity and responsibility. So what I'd love to do is maybe talk some specifics about what are the ethical answers that we're looking for, but also describe perhaps the Jewish difference in how we think about them. So, and you can plug your own framework into the answer. So Rabbi Dorff, let me turn to you first and say, how do we prioritize who gets a dose of vaccine? And does Jewish law line up the way we're doing it nationally? The CDC guidelines, who goes first, the elderly, first responders, all the way down to children. How does the Jewish framework plug into the answer to that question?
Well, the first thing I think that you need to know is that until the 20th century, medical curative care was not very effective and therefore was cheap. And therefore the question of allocating medical resources, scarce medical resources, was never part of the literature. The Jewish tradition Jewish communities did have to allocate scarce resources to the poor and also to people who were taken captive. And so if you look at Jewish sources on those issues, you do in fact get guidelines as to how to distribute scarce resources, in this case, vaccines. But of course, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at this, there's no one way in which the Jewish tradition has done this. There are actually 4 different ways in which the tradition has done it. One is that, depending on how you interpret this, but one is that a Mishnah says the Kohen comes before a Levi comes to Israel, and so on. If you don't see that just as being a function of how you were born, but rather what position you play in a society, because remember, the Kohanim were basically people who did the cult and made it possible for the Jewish people to thrive by virtue of their relationship to God. So if you see them that way, then what that source would say is that people on the front lines that are trying to keep us alive are the ones that should go first. All right. A second source would say that it's the most vulnerable, right? So women come before men in terms of dealing with poverty because it's safer for men to beg on the streets than for women. because otherwise, because women might be raped. Both might be attacked, but women might be raped and presumably cannot defend themselves as much as men can. So women come before men in terms of those kinds of things. So in the same sort of a way, the most vulnerable to COVID would be the ones that would come first under those circumstances. A third is your life comes first, right? So you have to take care of yourself first, then that of your family, then of your local Jewish community, then the larger Jewish community, and then the non-Jewish community, to make sure that we have good relationships with the non-Jewish community. So if you were doing that, right, and I really don't think it applies here, but I mean, it is important that you do. I mean, it's sort of like what you used to say on the airplanes: put a different kind of mask, an oxygen mask on yourself before you try to help others. Because if you can't live, then you can't help anybody else live, right? So you have to take care of yourself first, and the members of your family, and so on. I'm not really sure how that applies, if at all, frankly, to this case. And then the fourth thing that you get in the tradition is everybody is equal, right? Everybody's creating the image of God. Everybody, in which case it would be either a lottery or first come, first serve for the vaccines, or something on that order, right? So there are 4 different approaches in the tradition that you might apply to this situation. I think, well, Rabbi Peltz wrote the tshuva for allocating vaccines for the conservative movement, so he really should talk about it in terms of which of those he chose and why he chose them.
I think that's great. Okay, I think it's a great setup for Rabbi Peltz, so we'll do that right as soon as you're done.
Okay, so I mean, you know, and even if you're talking about it not from a Jewish point of view, I'm on the ethics committee at UCLA Medical Center, and when COVID first broke out, we had a lot. We usually meet 4 to 6 on Tuesday afternoons once a month, right? We were meeting every week for 3 hours to try to create a triage policy for ventilators at that time, later for vaccines, right? And you know, you have sort of a utilitarian approach. You try to keep as many people alive up to at least hospital discharge, or a Kantian approach. You may not treat somebody merely as a means, and so therefore you have to take everybody as equal, and you take first come first serve or a lottery or something like that. So even on a secular basis, there are these kinds of distinctions, and it's and then of course part of it has to do with what are the facts of the matter. In other words, who really is most vulnerable, and how does the virus spread? I mean, we didn't know very much about it early on. We know much more about it now. So I mean, even on, and by the way, we at UCLA we had come to a sort of quasi utilitarian approach, and we were trying to save as many lives to hospital discharge as possible. That's not a full utilitarian approach, because a full utilitarian approach would be to try to save as many life years as possible, in which case you would prefer young people over old people, right? But this was saving as many lives as possible. But then we had a meeting with 3 Black physicians. And one of the things they pointed out to us, well, if you're trying to save as many lives as possible, that means that you're going to triage out people with pre-existing conditions. But because this is not true for everybody, right? But a large percentage of people in the Black community are living in poverty or living with very different kinds and frankly, a diminished form of housing, a lot of them on the streets, food insecurity, clothing, shelter, all of that, right? And more likely to have diabetes and more likely to have not good access to healthcare, right? So if you are triaging out people with pre-existing conditions, because of the structural racism in our society, you are automatically triaging out a lot of Black people, right? So but then on the other hand, so are you going to do kind of an affirmative action, right? So if you had, let's say, a Black person and a white person,
so I the exact same thought on that, because I want to get back to that a little later.
Okay.
And we're running out of hands. There's so many.
I'm sorry.
Right? But no, I'm joking. But those are great points. That's a fantastic theoretical framework in which to ask Rabbi Peltz. So you had to sit down and synthesize a lot of your colleagues' thoughts on this, including Rabbi Dorf's. Give me an idea of of a specific dilemma that you answered about vaccines and what you drew upon to come to whatever conclusion you came to.
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. And it's appropriate I'm following Rabbi Dorff, as much of my work relies on his large body of work on this. So I'm always appreciative to him. As one of the ethicists who I work closely with on this, who's on the Law Committee Conservative Movement, Dr. Toby Schoenfeld, who's at the Veterans Administration, said, as I was speaking with her about this is about as hard and as complicated as it gets in terms of balancing all the different pieces, many of which Rabbi Dorff just spoke about, many more that we know, to try and figure out how ethically to distribute this vaccine. And what also makes this so complicated is that making decisions sometimes for public health, right, for the society, doesn't always make sense for the individuals, right? Just one example, I'm in New Jersey. I'm outside of Philadelphia in Cherry Hill, and one thing that's been very controversial in New Jersey is that smokers have been on the list of folks who are prioritized to get the vaccine. And I've gotten a number of questions about, how is that fair? I haven't smoked my entire life and I can't get the vaccine, whereas somebody who smoked is. And the truth of the matter is, whereas we certainly condemn smoking, and the Law Committee, the movement has been very clear that smoking is forbidden by halacha, from a public health perspective, and I'd even say from a Jewish law perspective, where we're trying to save those who are in the most immediate and grave danger as one of those top priorities, one can make a public health argument that someone who has been a smoker who puts in a more vulnerable position should be prioritized versus someone who isn't, for example. So let me step back a little bit. So first of all, in trying to sort through these different texts and the different values that come out of it, obviously, ideally, we treat people equally and we have enough supply and everyone could, in some sort of lottery, first come, first serve system could sign up for the vaccine. We know that's not possible. So therefore, then we try to move into who is the most immediate and grave danger. That's where I do think, frontline medical workers certainly fall under that category. Those who we know have certain health conditions or who live in nursing homes or facilities like that would certainly fall in that category. And we've seen, like smoking is one thing I mentioned, but there are certainly less controversial immunocompromised folks and other people who have other sort of health conditions that would make sense to prioritize them in this. I also think that Rabbi Dorff mentioned utilitarianism, which is something is very controversial when it comes to Jewish law. Actually, I factored it into my approach. Rabbi Danny Nevins, who's also on the Law Committee, wrote a dissent about that. But certainly, I think trying to save the most people is something that's important in all of this. And also trying to think about social usefulness, I think, is another factor that comes in all of this. For example, you could say that about physicians, certainly. But what about public figures, right? I mean, we've had some politicians, we've had other public figures, especially in the minority community, which happened in South Jersey, where I am, is trying to encourage those populations that might be more hesitant to get the vaccine to have more public figures get vaccinated to help show that it's safe and encourage more people to take it. I think that's something else that should factor in these ethical considerations. Something else I do, though, make clear in my paper is as important it is to understand the Jewish approach to all of this. It's also important to remember the concept of dina de malchuta dina, which is that the law of the land is the law. And in other words, if the government, whether it's the federal government or your state government, sets certain guidelines for who ought to get the vaccine, well, we might disagree with some of them, or they might not be line up exactly how we might prioritize them. I do think we do, at the end of the day, have a duty to try to adhere to those guidelines and to wait our turn to get vaccinated and to help others who might be before us to get vaccinated to help them get those appointments.
Mm-hmm. So thank you. Rabbi Pell, Dr. Osmond, I wanted to ask you, you're a practitioner as well as someone who regularly delves into Jewish law. Do you have an example of something that's come up Talkless in your own line of work where you really had to draw on or advise on some of the ethical lessons you've learned just from your Jewish learning?
Yeah, I think this issue with the particular algorithm that different states, governments are using for the vaccine is really interesting. And, I think actually it's caused some personal angst for people. So for example, very early on, I think in the second level category in New York State, members of the Kadisha, for example, were entitled to sign up for the vaccine. And so I know that some of the funeral homes were giving out letters to members of the Kadisha. Now, for example, where I live in Riverdale, many of those funeral homes actually had moved over to a professional sort of chevra. In other words, they weren't taking the regular volunteers because they wanted to protect those volunteers, in case they would have to work on a body that had been sick or passed away from COVID. So when some members of my community were arranging these letters, we did get a number of calls from people who said, well, I don't feel it's right for me to take it now, right? I'm not actually actively participating in the Chevra Kadisha. It's sort of been on hold. Yes, I'm a proud member. It's a mitzvah that's very meaningful to me. But right now, that's not how our community is necessarily functioning. And, I think it really took a lot of saying to people, kind of like in the Dina de Machuta Dina way, but you didn't come up with that algorithm, right? And at some point, we sort of just have to go with whatever the government said, and whether or not you're having direct contact or not having direct contact, it's sort of not what you can worry about, but you waited your turn, you happen to fall in a category of that turn, and almost in a way of sort of, in a way that I appreciate of us as Jewish people tend to overthink things, but almost in a way to tell people like to take a deep breath, it's your turn and it's okay to do. And while I appreciated the notion that maybe you're not having direct contact, I knew of a number of people who were actually a little bit not comfortable with the way that the algorithm, per se fell out. And I think what's particularly challenging in the United States, because it is such a large country, is that it's so different. And I'm even starting to see, you speak to people, like my mother lives in Florida, so she was vaccinated very early on. And, that may change how we can spend Passover together. But I've, certainly have friends whose parents live, let's say, in other states where their parents have not had access yet to the vaccine. And I think that's very frustrating to people, because as much as we're saying sort of this government approach, the United States is going to decide. I think one of the particular challenges in the United States is some of these algorithms or the ethical decision-making is actually sort of, state to state. And, I think just to think about some of the other ethical considerations, like, for example, one, I've seen some work done that one could make an argument that, yes, frontline workers, they should get it, they're exposed, but people who are secluded, maybe those shouldn't be the ones to get it first, because in a way they're safest at this point in time. But yet, from an ethical point of view, I think all of us understand the psychological, which I think we could even put in a pikuach nefesh category, right? That, what this has done to people to literally, I mean, for me personally, my children's school, they go to SAR Academy. We were shut down exactly a year ago today. We were the first school in the country to be shut down on March 3rd. There are people who have basically lived in isolation for a year. So is that really a group of people that should really be prioritized, because frontline workers have PPE, they have ways to protect themselves that, let's say, the rest of society doesn't, and the seclusion issue is so damaging psychologically, that's really groups of people that we really should try to have vaccinated very quickly.
Well, that raises another issue, which I think is, so far we've been talking about pikuach nefesh and saving a life and the integrity of the individual, but the psychological question inches towards other values. And the one I think about is whether, by keeping businesses and schools and restaurants and all this, and the economy closed down, that has its own major public health impact. So I'll throw this open to any of you really to say, like, do we have any guidance, any insight in how to weigh, the good of the societal, the health of an economy versus, the bodily integrity of every person who deserves a cure or a vaccine?
Well, I actually wrote a tshuva for the law committee on loneliness during the pandemic. Early on, actually, this was back in June. In part, I'm a past president of Jewish Family Service in Los Angeles. And so I have, been very much involved with Jewish Family Service in Los Angeles runs about 50 different kinds of programs for mental health issues. And we've seen, not just among Jews, but in the general population, a major uptick in depression and alcoholism, in family violence, all kinds of things like that, in addition to what Dr. Osmond was talking about, namely the issues among children and teenagers about, first of all, not being able to learn, and therefore the anxiety over that. And then besides that, I mean, not being able to be with other people. And of course, that is the name of the game as you're growing up in terms of how you figure out who you are and how you relate to other people. I mean, back to Robert Fulghum's book, you know, All I Ever Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Well, if you're not together in kindergarten, then you're not learning those things, right? And you're not able to enjoy each other's company and play ball together and all of that, right? But even for adults, and you know, one of the things in that tshuva that I quote is Genesis chapter 2. It's not good for a person to be alone. Or to quote another ancient Jewish source, people who need people are the luckiest people in the world. Anyway, Barbara Streisand is a few years older than I am, but I guess I'm ancient, so therefore she is as well. But the point is that, all kidding aside, I mean, we have very good evidence, let's say in the prison environment, short of execution and torture, the harshest penalty is solitary confinement. And unfortunately, we have a lot of evidence of people who have been held in solitary for very long periods of time, and they go insane. Or many of them do anyway. So, I mean, we really have as deep a need as we have for our physical health. We also have at least a deeper need for our mental health. And a lot of that is a function of our interaction with other people. We have a deep psychological need to have that kind of interaction. So among the things that I say in that tshuva is that you can't reach out and touch someone these days, but you definitely do need to reach out and use whatever method you can. I mean, FaceTime, Zoom, the phone still works. You know, I must say that over the last number of weeks, I've had a number of conversations. Well, in one case with a high school friend of mine, it happens to be, I'm old, my 60th anniversary of my high school reunion. I'm 77, you don't have to guess. I'll be 78 in June. Anyway, and I must say it was a lot of fun. I mean, we caught up together. It was really, but you need to make time to do that in order to be able to sort of reconnect with people and all of that, because it's good for them as well as for you. It's not just selfish. And you need to find ways. I mean, my kids now have set up this family thing that happens about once a month, and which we play a game together. It's called Psycho, I think, or something. And it's a lot of fun. First of all, we get together. We're not just talking. We're doing something together, and you know, and it's fun. And you can cheat on the game. It's really a lot of fun. But the point is that you need to do that in order to be able to sustain your own mental health. And then you were talking about, by the way, in terms of physical health, one of the really difficult, Rabbi Peltz was talking about people who smoke. What about people in prisons, right? I can distance myself from other people, right? But they can't. And, you know, and certainly in California, and I imagine other areas of the world as well, people in prison are really vulnerable to this. Right. And we've seen it spread throughout the prison system. And remember, when the state takes custody of somebody, the state takes on the responsibility for preserving that person's life and health. So if we, as the state of whatever we are, if we, the citizens of whatever state, we as a group have the responsibility to preserve their health as well. Now, on the other hand, right, I mean, they're in prison presumably for a good reason, and so should you preserve felons before you preserve life of law-abiding people? I mean, there you go again, right? In terms of how this is just so complicated an issue. But back to the mental health issues. I mean, this is not something we should be embarrassed about, right? We live in an American society which is so this Anglo-American stiff upper lip stuff, right? It certainly is nonsense now, right? We need to recognize that we have these needs, and that they are perfectly normal, and that they need to be fulfilled. And so people, if you need help, you need to get it, right? In terms of social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, whatever. or just simply people to give you ideas of what to do online with each other. You really, this is a critically important piece of this. And by the way, Jewishly, this is much more at the root of our tradition than it is in terms of the secular tradition or the Christian tradition, right? And in the secular tradition, starting with Plato, there's a sharp distinction between body and mind. And so the mind-body problem in Western philosophy is a continual problem to our own day. If the mind and the body are so separate, how are they at all connected? In Plato, the mind was the body was is the animal in us, the mind is the distinctly human, and he has no way of understanding how they're connected. Descartes thought they were connected in the pineal gland. It's a gland in your head. Now we're doing MRI studies to find out, with vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, in nanoseconds, how can you figure out whether you have that free will or not? Right. By the way, the answer to that is none of the above. It's mint chocolate chip. But the point is that it's in the Jewish tradition, though, starting in the Talmud, Sanhedrin 91a, right? There's a story of a man who has an orchard. He leaves it in the control of a blind man and a lame man. He says, "Don't eat any of the fruit of the orchard," and he leaves. As soon as he leaves, the blind man says to the lame man, "This is easy. I'll put you on my shoulders, and we'll go and eat, and you'll show me where to go. We'll eat of the fruit of the orchard, will never figure it out." So that's what they do. The owner comes back and says, "I thought I told you not to eat of it." The blind man says, "I couldn't, I can't see it." The lame man says, "I can see it, but I couldn't possibly reach it." And the owner takes the lame man, puts him on the shoulders of the blind man and says, "This is how you did it. This is how you'll be judged." Similarly, says the Talmud, the body says, "I can't lead a person to sin because without the neshama, the life breath within me, right, I'm like an inert stone. And in the same way that a stone can't sin, I couldn't sin." With the neshama says, "Without the body, I could not possibly sin because I'm like an ethereal bird flying in the air like wind," right? So God takes the neshama, throws it, that's literally the Talmud's term, ramini, throws it into the body and says, "This is how you were created. This is how you were judged. You will be judged." Now, this is a simple story, but it flies to the face of all Western thought and all Christian thought. We are integrated wholes. Our body, our mind, our emotions, our will, they all contribute to everything else. The way I feel about myself will affect how I treat my body, and the way I treat my body will affect how I feel about myself and how I think about myself.
Right.
So these mental health issues, from a Jewish perspective, are at least as critical as the physical health issues.
So I want to ask one more question, and thank you for that, Torah. I'll never forget that story. I want to ask one more question about the scarcity of getting vaccines before I move on to another topic. But I want to go back to something that Rabbi Dorf said earlier and present it to either Rabbi Peltz or Dr. Osban, which is the idea of making distinctions among ethnic groups. I mean, we know that people of color are at higher risk than white Americans for all the worst outcomes from this disease. And how comfortable are you as citizens, practitioners, observers, and from a Jewish perspective in creating a triage that takes that into account?
I mean, I think from a medical point of view, we're obligated to. And more medicine is recognizing where different ethnicities and race really are factor into how medicine is practiced and medical decision making, whether it's bias with patients, how studies are structured, the fact that we really do have a large population of a particular, ethnic or racial group in this country who is very vaccine hesitant. And I think, if we consider ourselves sort of be good citizens of society, these are all things that we need to think about. And I think that gets into a broader ethical issue, which is, just observing in all different ways of how the pandemic has affected so many areas of life. I think we tend to, as a community, certainly sort of be very close and worry about the Jewish ethics. But I think this has really given us an opportunity to think about where do we fit in really in American society. So for me personally, something I've really been struggling with is, I know I mentioned before my children's school closed a year ago, but we've had school this whole year, 5 days a week. But I'm in New York City where 1.4 million children are currently not in school. It's sort of open, it's not open, but the majority of my patients, they're not in school this year. What's our ethical obligation around that, right? Thinking about all the things we know psychologically, I think the damage and the mental health toll on children is going to follow us for years to come. Children who have literally lost a year to 2 years of schooling, where do we fall into that? Is it good enough to say, well, our kids were educated for the year? And I really want to challenge us as a group to say that's actually not good enough. Like, if we really believe in this concept of B'Tselem Elokim, what are we doing to make sure all children have access to school the way they need to? All ethnic and race groups have, access to good medical care, to good advice, to understanding the vaccine. I think it's an issue actually, not just around the vaccine, but around a whole host of issues that are actually pandemic related.
And I'll just jump in there. I couldn't agree more. And I think the question that comes from halakha that I mentioned before, which is, who is in the most immediate and grave danger, very much is at play here, both in terms of the vaccinations we've seen in many minority communities. There's been higher rates of infection and spread in those communities, which I think should prioritize the vaccination there. But also it speaks to the educational issues, the mental health issues, the psychological issues. My wife is the head of school of a Jewish day school here at Kalman Brown Academy, which also has been in school since September, and I've been fortunate that my kids have been as well. But she, as an educator, and as a school that works with other schools in Camden, New Jersey, for example, and other places as well, is just, she's sick about how many students have not been in school, particularly in minority communities, and what an incredible impact, and how much I don't think it's quite appreciated yet, the type of impact that's going to have on that educational, psychological, academic development. And I do think that's something that should be on our priority list as a Jewish community too, to think in an ongoing way about the role that we can play to try to mitigate that as well down the line.
One of the major Jewish community questions that came up this year, and it put an unfortunate spotlight on one segment of the community, but I don't think it was only that segment, which is the idea of either mask refusal or vaccine refusal, or ignoring public health guidelines. And we saw that in some of the Kharidi communities in the New York area, in Israel as well, but not only. So I want to ask a question about someone's obligation under Jewish law to either receive a vaccine or to, I think we talked a little about, follow the law of the land, public health guidelines, but are people obligated to receive a vaccine? We had someone argue in the Jewish Week a couple of weeks ago that to not get the vaccine is tantamount to standing idly by while another person is being assaulted. So is that a Jewish ethic, and is it in conflict with an American legal ethic where people have, I think, a lot of choice when it comes to that? Rabbi Peltz, you want to take it while you're there?
Sure. I addressed that head on in my tshuva, and yes, I think we do have an obligation to get the vaccine. We have had a position before, and it's not just in the conservative movement. This is pretty widespread in the Orthodox community as well, that vaccination would be something that would be a mitzvah at a minimum, very strongly advised. A number of years ago, when there was the measles outbreak in the Orthodox community, there's a number of things written about that as well. The difference here that I think we had to work on was what happens when that vaccine isn't tried and true, so to speak. It's been approved under the emergency use authorization, as opposed to years of its usual process that it goes through. But the concept in halakha is the question is it a refuah b'duka, right? Is it a treatment that has been tested? And that is actually a fairly lower bar when it comes to halakha than it does to the FDA or the CDC, for example. And there are sources around Edwin Jenner's smallpox vaccine. Well, it wasn't a vaccine then, but that came out that would say that it was a 1 in 1,000th chance of preventing the smallpox, then one should take it, for example. Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz says. So, I think from a Jewish standpoint, very much so. And I think for those who, are not going to get vaccinated, they clearly come up against not just lo tamo dam re'echa, not standing by the blood of your neighbor, but also in Devarim, also in Deuteronomy, we read about the makah, right? The parapet or the guardrail you're supposed to put on your roof. to prevent people from falling, that is really analyzed through halakhic literature, through Maimonides, through the Shulchan Aruch, as as being an obligation to protect not only your house but other people's health. And that's why not only the vaccine, but also the wearing masks, social distancing, washing hands frequently, all of that, which Rabbi Dorf wrote about also, I consider to be mitzvot, to be obligations to not only protect ourselves but to protect the health of others.
Okay, Rabbi Dorf, did you want to respond to that or have anything to add to that?
No, I agree completely. And I mean, I would hope. Look, I'm a conservative rabbi. I've thought an awful lot about why I wanted to be part of the conservative movement. I've written 2 books about it, right? But still, I'm a pluralist, right? I'm really glad that Jews are able to attach to the Jewish tradition in ways that are meaningful to them, right? But to a point, right? So if people decide to be Kharidi, from my perspective, may tavo alehem bracha, may they be blessed in their decisions, right? Except to the point where you get to questions of life and death, and that's really what's going on here. I mean, setting aside halakha for the moment, simply on a pragmatic level, I mean, a lot of them are dying. They're dying, and I saw a statistic that they are 11% of the Israeli population and 40% of the people in Israel who have died of COVID, right? So even from just simply self-interest, forget about halakha, everything, just self-interest, one would think that their leader should tell people to wear masks, to socially distance and all of that. And halachically, it's a no-brainer. Pikuach, nefesh, docha, everything except 3 things, which are not this, which are not observing Shabbat, observing kashrut, going to weddings, going to funerals, none of that is in the 3. The 3 are murder, incest, adultery, and idolatry. Those are the 3 exceptions to making, you have to prefer not to violate those laws, even if it means at the cost of your life. But going to a wedding or a funeral is not one of those, right? Even going to shul is not, the services on a daily or weekly basis, that's not one of those either, right? So halachically, it's a no-brainer, simply a no-brainer. This is not a matter of dispute, that pikuach nefesh takes precedence over these things. So, I mean, look, I'm not a Kharidi Jew. I've thought a lot about that too, and I could never be, and they would not want me. I have a PhD in philosophy. I had a philosophy professor in graduate school one time who said a philosopher is a 5-year-old child who never stopped asking why. That's who I am. I asked too many questions. They would not want me. And I'll leave it at that, okay? But that said, I mean, I really would hope that their leaders would begin to sort of wake up to what's going on and what implications it has for their own community in not wearing masks and not getting vaccinated and having these I mean, throngs of people at funerals and at weddings and all of that. It's just self-destructive.
Yeah, I think the Kharidi question is an interesting question. I mean, I identify as Orthodox, I guess you would say. And I personally think what we've really been seeing is sort of real schisms between sort of different groups of Judaism and how it's been playing out, throughout COVID and the pandemic. And I think some of it is actually just a different approach to medicine, to sort of when do you believe sort of like it's your time is your time. So, I was speaking to a Kharidi relative of mine. I have some Kharidi relatives. And somebody was getting married, and this Kharidi relative said they were not going to go to the wedding because it was, let's say, not COVID safe, 125 people in a large space, but not necessarily enforcing masks and things like this. And, they called to ask my medical opinion, and I said, yes, you should not be going. And then the person ended by saying the following, but I want to be clear with you that by my choosing not to go, this does not determine whether or not I get sick or whether or not I die. When Hashem feels that it's time for me to die, that's when I'm going to die. And this conversation was so enlightening to me because it really gave a very different perspective, I think, of what's going on. I 100% agree that I think there's definitely been a failure with some rabbinic leadership sort of not in a forceful way saying we don't need 10,000 people at a funeral or things like that. But I think the piece that many people are missing in that discussion is it's a very different viewpoint of how you view what your relationship is to what happens in this world and where is God's influence on that. And this relative really had a belief, that their particular actions are not going to change what the ultimate outcome is going to be. Now, I didn't ask that person, but you still wear a seatbelt. You still have a fire alarm. I think you could take it to a very illogical conclusion. But I think that is some of what's going on here. And I think the ethical issue for me, at least, that gets raised with this is, first of all, I'm sure many of you who are listening, I certainly have been in situations now where at work, colleagues have asked me about this, and it's, quite frankly, you're not quite sure what to answer. Why do I see pictures of Jews doing this? Is this how all Jews behave, or things like that? And so sort of what is our obligation from a chiluk, kiddush Hashem, right? Sanctifying or not sanctifying God's name, to either justify this? Do we say at some point that some of this behavior is so abhorrent that is it okay for us to say, this is not who we are? Or are we obligated to really say, no, these are our brothers and, our brothers and our sisters, and we sort of still have to stick up for them in a way? And I don't have a good answer to this. I personally have really been struggling with some of these issues.
I just think it's important. I think it's important to say that the Orthodox Union and the Rabbinical Council of America came out with a statement saying you should get vaccinated, right? Like it's in Orthodoxy, kind of those institutions and those poskim, those rabbis said, like, go and get vaccinated. And we're talking about the Kharidi community, Orthodox community here, which has been, let's say, less forceful in that. And I do think that it is symptomatic. I don't mean that in any sort of funny way, but of a broader challenge that we have in the Jewish community. And I think Dr. Osban was articulating this of, our relationship to our brothers and sisters in the Kharidi community and their relationship to us. And I think in a lot of ways, we're living in different worlds, and thinking about what that means for the Jewish people and Jewish peoplehood, and what our obligations are to one another, and how that looks for one community other to the rest of the world. This has put that out there in a way that I think has flared up now and then, but in a very, very public way, and I think on people's minds more so than before. But it's something I think has been going on for a long time, and will continue, and is something that we all could devote more energy towards trying to heal.
Rabbi Peltz, what are some of the real talkless questions, the real concrete questions that people are asking you, let's say in your congregation? I can think of I see the Facebook conversation. Should I pass up a dose if I think I don't need it as much as someone else, even though I qualify?
Yeah.
What are people really worried about, and maybe how has that changed over the last year?
Sure. So it's interesting. When I started writing this tshuva, no vaccines had been approved yet, and then when it was voted for, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines had just been approved, and frontline workers, or not even medical workers, were just getting it. And then it came out, and then everything got super, super complicated. I think one of the big questions that I have been asked, has been, should I pass up a vaccine if I feel like someone else should get that vaccine? To which my answer has been no, right? If you're within those guidelines that have been given by the state and you've been asked to get the vaccine, or have the opportunity to get the vaccine, I think you should get vaccinated. Because something else in all this that we need to keep in mind is that each person vaccinated is a small step towards the end of this, right? Which shouldn't be an excuse to jump the line. And that's been another big question. What does it mean to jump the line? If someone who I know calls me from this hospital system and says, hey, you want to come get a dose, my turn doesn't come up later, is that jumping the line? Or does it happen that you get a call that say, hey, we have extra vaccines at the end of the day, you're on a wait list, can you come get it? Is that jumping the line? Generally speaking, I feel that if your kind of number is up, so to speak, or if there's extra doses that are going to go to waste, get the vaccine, right? Because that's going to not only protect you, but it's one more step in protecting all of us. I think what gets problematic ethically with the jumping the line is where you hear things of, people who either, lie on those intake forms in terms of some pre-existing conditions they have to get an earlier appointment, or use connections in a way that would move them up that when they otherwise wouldn't have got it, or or financially do that as well. Those are things that we shouldn't do. But it's not clear, and it's very fuzzy to try to figure all these pieces out. And I'll say for me, I mean, I got a call at the end of January from our hospital system in South Jersey saying we're going to start vaccinating clergy. And I say, we want to move them up to the 1B category, about ready for that. We want to do clergy. My first response was, you got to be kidding me, right? Like, I can think of 200 people in my congregation I'd rather get this before me, and my parents I'd rather get this before me. Like, why clergy? And it was fascinating because it was a combination of ethical, practical, and logistical reasons, right? One, they wanted clergy to come, especially, African-American clergy, to set an example for their community. And they weren't just going to invite one denomination of clergy, they wanted to invite all the clergy in South Jersey. Two, they're opening a mega site in the area, and they didn't have enough doses left for the mega site, and they couldn't get more doses, though, until they used up enough of doses they had for the hospital system. And clergy was the right amount of people within the community that could get them below that number to get more doses to vaccinate more people, right? So it just, this stuff is hard. But I think the rule of thumb, and if people are thinking about it, is if your kind of number is up, even if you're healthy and all of that, I think you should get vaccinated. And also, it's not so simple, and it's not always possible. It's usually not possible to say, like, hey, I'll get an appointment and I'll give it to my father, right, who I'd really rather have it, right? It generally doesn't work that way. But you should try to get vaccinated as soon as your time comes up to do that.
Right. I guess, I don't know if this is an ethical question or a theological question, but I'll ask it this way. I said, does Judaism believe in hell? And is Texas Governor Greg Abbott going there because he just opened up the state 100%? So the serious question behind that is, have any of you seen this as a real ethical failing on the parts of not just a public policy failing, but really a question of people having their priorities in the wrong place from any understanding, whether it's a Jewish understanding or just a general Kantian understanding of what we owe each other as citizens of this country. So I throw that very leading question up to anyone who wants to talk about public policy and ethics.
Yeah, I'm not so worried about Texas. I'll get back to something I said before. I think what has happened to education in this country is the biggest ethical and moral failing, that we've really uncovered sort of the have and have nots. Private schools are in school, the poor and those who really need school almost in a way the most are not in school. And it's unclear to me why people are not shouting from the rooftops about this. And I actually think this in particular is going to destabilize this country. I don't mean to be all doom and gloom, but it's what it uncovered in terms of how the economic injustice in this country that really, and I put myself in that category, has sort of always turned a little bit of a blind eye to, but we're really seeing it played out on the backs of children.
I think that's a critically important point. And I think it's one that we really need to focus on because we're talking about this next generation and the implications for our society thereafter. But what I was answering your question directly was what I was about to say was that Judaism does not believe in hell, but Governor Abbott is a Christian and he does. And yes, he is going there. Right.
You clarified that. Okay, good.
Right. No, all kidding aside, I mean, people, I understand. I mean, this is one of the places where the Jewish tradition is really very different from the American tradition. The American tradition is very heavily individualistic. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the American understanding of things is I'm an individual with rights, right? The central Jewish story is Exodus, Sinai, the trek to the Promised Land. We leave Egypt not as individuals, but as a community. And when we get to Sinai, we don't get a single right. We get 613 commandments. Now, I do a lot of interfaith work, a lot of it with Catholics, and So I say that, this is the beginning of Jewish guilt. We have 613 commandments, but they tell me we know nothing about guilt. They have it cornered. Okay, so maybe, all right? But the point is that now sometimes rights and duties are reciprocal. So if I have a right to my property, you have a duty not to steal it, right? But rights and duties are not always reciprocal. My duties to my parents are different from my duties to my children, and different from my duties to my country, and in the converse way also. My country's duties to me are different from mine to my country. And in any case, if I get up in the morning and I'm an individual with rights, then the world owes me. But if I get up in the morning and I'm a member of a community with duties, then I owe the world, right? So the Jewish tradition, very much along the lines that Rabbi Peltz was talking about, is really interested in public policy and in the ways in which we need to be together as a community in order to meet our challenges. The reason why you get somebody like Governor Abbott and others like him is because, first of all, he's a Christian, and in the Christian tradition, it's individuals who are saved or damned. And the American tradition just reinforces that as being people with liberty, right? And as American Jews, we balance those pieces of our identity throughout all our lives, both privately and publicly. And I think one of the things that we Jews can bring to the public discussion is a very strong sense of being part of a community, and therefore having obligations to the community to try to protect everyone within it, right? Both physically and psychologically and educationally, right? And that kind of deep level of obligation that we Jews all feel to each other, I think we also have to feel to America as American citizens, and have to try to make our society as safe and as both physically, psychologically, and intellectually, educationally as possible. And in order to do that, we have to abide by the guidelines that the people in public health are telling us.
Go ahead. I'm
We
sorry.
just add a quick thought on that. I mean, listen, the economic costs of this are real, right? And people have been affected by that. But I think, what's frustrated me, and I'm sure many others from all this, is how much it's either or, right? Either you're open and everybody's there without masks, or you're shut everything down and you're not coming. And the unwillingness of, leaders to say, like, all right, to acknowledge this is hard, that we need to work on the economics, we need to care about public health. How can we find that middle ground to try to make both happen and have an honest conversation, as opposed to just saying it's this or it's that? I mean, it has led to tragedy. I mean, I think there's no other way to say it. I mean, it's been very tragic to see how that's unfolded. And I think it hasn't taken seriously both the public health concerns, which I think, from the Jewish tradition are very strong, and also the economic concerns, which we can cite many Jewish sources about the importance of, that as well. And when you have those two in tension with one another, you need to try to work those out as opposed to choosing one or the other. And that's what we've been missing.
Yeah.
We have just a few minutes left, so I just want to ask you each really to take literally a minute each and talk about, the series is about a year in. After a year, what's changed for you? What's different? What's new? What did you learn? What won't you forget? Just what's the one lesson you find yourself dwelling on as we approach, I guess we're at the 1-year anniversary of this. Rabbi Peltz, you're on screen, so why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Well, I think like a lot of rabbis and synagogues, a lot of Jews have been going to synagogue, Purim this year was particularly kind of meaningful because it was completed a full year cycle of Jewish holidays during the pandemic, right? And with Pesach kind of starts, year 2 of it. And it was sort of a sad milestone to come to, whereas this is sort of the last holiday that we've now celebrated virtually, as opposed to in our shul. But even with that, I have to say, as I kind of reflected back on the year, which of course we know has been a very difficult year and a very challenging year, I do think we are learning. I can't say learned yet, at least for myself. I'm still very much learning. But what it means to be in community. I think community is being redefined during this time. We don't know exactly what that means. And I think the ways in which we connect people to Judaism and to each other are being redefined, and we still don't know exactly what that means. But I think it's really given us a lot of tools, and it also has served to educate an entire population of people who never thought they could do this on technology, which also gives us more opportunities to be able to gather together. And you know, it's something that we're thinking a lot about, and I think a lot of the American Jewish community is thinking all about, which is you know, how are we able to use what we've learned during this time to help you know, further our mission to help bring more Jews closer to Judaism and to the Jewish people.
Dr. Osmond? Thank you.
So I'm going to agree. I still feel like I'm learning. I don't know what I've learned. But I think when I reflect on the past year, you know, I've learned a little bit how, in a humble way, how little I need and how little it takes to actually make meaningful human connection and how much we all crave them.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. And Rabbi Dorf.
Well, I've certainly learned how to do Zoom, and thank God for Zoom. Can you imagine if we didn't have it during this pandemic? Oh my God. Talk about the psychological issues, they would be multiplied 10 times at least if we were not able to communicate in this kind of a way, or FaceTime, or whatever it is you're using. And I think one of the things that we've learned is that some things we actually can do this way, and pretty well. I mean, many more people are attending classes including Jewish issues than did when they had to get in the car and drive somewhere. So we can probably do some of this, at least for adult education, online, but not all of it. I mean, you know, all of my classes at the university have been, and I was teaching at the law school this past semester, they've all been online, and I'd much prefer to be in a room together around the table.
Sure.
Right? I'd much, I mean, I really miss davening. Yeah, I mean, you can do some of it on Zoom, but it's not the same. I mean, you can't sing on Zoom. You simply cannot sing together on Zoom, right? You cannot talk with your friends. You cannot share a Kiddush with each other, right? I'm really itching to get back to the davening together, right? And you know, yes, Netflix is wonderful, but going out to a movie is a whole different experience, right? Let alone going to a ball game or something like that, right? So I mean, I think what has been very reinforced for me is the real need that we have as people to be together, and how we can, and I think if anything, it really shines a light on how we can maximize our times together once this is over, and no longer take it for granted.
That's terrific. Thank you. I want to thank you all so much for your wisdom and your insight. And of course, I want to wish everyone best of health. That's the most important thing. I hope our viewers will also join us tomorrow as our 1 Year In series continues. At 4 p.m. tomorrow, we're going to have a Zoom panel on how 70 Faces media editors from all the different properties, how we covered the Jewish world during these unprecedented times. So you'll get another chance to see me as well as my colleagues from JTA, My Jewish Learning, Feller, Alma, the Nasher. And on Friday, to kind of wrap this all up and literally take a deep breath, Friday at 4 p.m., Rabbi Danielle Upbin will have a session on stress busters for parents, a guided Jewish meditation. It's a short relaxation experience with tips for steeling yourself for the still difficult months ahead, unfortunately. And that's Friday at 4 p.m. So again, I want to thank all of our guests, and I want to thank everyone who came and watched for a really enlightening discussion. And good afternoon, and please stay healthy.